Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to this Youth Summit and conference. I'm eager to understand what you've been exploring, what you've come up with, what you think are the issues, and what personal actions and macro-level actions need to be taken. Actually, I was surprised when Lakshmi Dee told me about the theme of the conference. Climate change is not an easy topic. And how do we go about it? But I think listening to the talks so far, listening to the conference chair, I think it was really a wise decision. While prime ministers and presidents are discussing what governments can do or will not do in Glasgow or in Egypt later this year, it's equally important to explore and understand what we can do locally. Climate change is a challenge that not only governments have to take on, but we have to explore within ourselves, within our communities, within our schools, within our homes, our neighborhoods, friends and family. What is it that we can do? And interacting with you all, with other schools and youth, I sense both a sense of hope. Of course, there has always also been a sense of anger, of despair, what have you done? But I think there's also increasingly much greater engagement, much greater exploration that, okay, we have this challenge ahead of us. What do we need to do to live up to the challenge? And I think that is what is going to be most important to hold on to. It's also important to hold on to the anger, I think, because that is also a spur, but very much more a sense of really trying to see in this difficult situation, what is it that we can do singly, together, with everybody. So for example, my colleagues and I have been interacting along with UNICEF and Nehru Yuva Kendra and other youth groups in different parts of Maharashtra just in the recent weeks. And, in Osmanabad and Konkan. So we see that young people are interested in looking at the status of waste management, the status of water, very much also topics that you've been looking at. And trying to see that what is it in the system, in the local system around them, and also, of course, at larger levels, that's failing, So what is the status? What is the gap? What is it that we need to do, of course, in our own lives, in terms of things that people already do know, that we must segregate our waste, etc., but also where in a local policy or in state policy, where are the gaps that we also need to raise our voice for, where we also need to do a little bit more research, where can we engage with policymakers and decision makers, and what are the skills we need to be able to do that. How do we do fact-finding? Who are we speaking with? What are the research skills that we employ? How do we put things together from primary surveys, from literature, from our analysis, and what is the case that we are able to make? How are we taking the analysis and communicating it to people around us, to our community, and to maybe the municipal commissioner, to the district collector? So, in Osmanabad, where we were interacting with youth just last month, it's a drought-prone area, and also some parts of Pune have water shortages. And there, in a drought-prone area, there are farmers growing sugarcane because it makes eminent economic sense to do that. But then when you look at the maps of the projections of precipitation uncertainty, rainfall uncertainty, something needs to change. But what is it? The government does have schemes for micro-irrigation, for better water usage in agriculture. And students do realize, and youth are realizing that there is a problem, there is a stated solution. However, there seems to be limited uptake. Now, why is it? What is the problem? And why is there limited uptake? Is it that people didn't understand that sugarcane is a water-intensive crop? I think that is fairly well understood. Is it that the scheme that there might be a solution with micro-irrigation or with changing cropping patterns, and what is the support for that? Is that what is the missing link? Is it that electricity has been free, we've been using it too profligately all along? Is it that we didn't pay our electricity bills, so we don't become eligible for micro-irrigation schemes? So looking at that sort of systems analysis to find out what the issue was, and then trying to advocate for the next steps which might drive a positive action. So it's not only that I, as a farmer, try to adopt a better irrigation technique, perhaps, or try to change my crop, but also this other external analysis which tries to identify what could be other larger steps which would create a systems change. Similarly, in Ratnagiri and also in Pune, we find very limited wastewater treatment. Now, wastewater treatment becomes really important not only because, waterborne diseases will be more prevalent, are more prevalent, in fact, and also, as we know, with the changing climate, the duration that is good for mosquitoes to proliferate, that time period is much longer now. And again, so there is a need to set up wastewater systems, whether it's individual soak pits or it's better fecal sludge management, or at the city scale, which Pune hopefully will do. We should be setting up new treatment capacity in the future. But what is it that is preventing uptake? So there is a Jal Jeevan mission. There is some water users committees supposed to be set up in villages, which are supposed to guide how the implementation happens, who are the most deserving. So can youth participate in this? Actually make sure that these committees are set up, that girls and women are part of it, that where the needs are becoming quite evident, and the process is transparent. And I think that this realization that wastewater is not only just wastewater, but it's a resource. And in a resource-constrained environment, we will need to harvest both the water and the waste, which is actually fertilizer. And so figuring out these dimensions and trying to see more benefits that can accrue from a single solution, this also becomes quite important. We know that many of us in Pune do segregate waste, and we do make sure, and I can see that all the work that you've done exploring the issue, that plastic, paper, glass, etc., go for recycling. So, however, it's difficult and expensive when the value of what is to be recycled is not paying for the effort and the transport cost of recycling, And so there is a new law which perhaps you've already explored, which is called the extended producer responsibility. And therein, manufacturers are expected to pay for this missing link, that low-value plastics like multi-layer plastics, the chips, packets, etc., that those are in fact collected. Otherwise, they may not even fetch 50 paisa or 1 rupee per kg, but the actual human effort involved in collecting this needs to pay, it needs to be paid for. And companies are now expected to have a certain percentage of the material that they use to be coming from recycled material. But this becomes a problem it's fine in Pune, because the number of chips and namkeens and things that we eat is so high that there's literally tons of multi-layer plastic which is produced every day, waste which is produced every day in Pune. And with the commitment that Swachh has of reaching all the households and taking segregated waste, it's possible to collect a truck full and send it to a place near Bombay for recycling. But that's not the case in a place like Ratnagiri, where the density is not that high, the villages and towns are smaller, And we find that even, the same sort of chicken and egg thing, I segregate my waste, but it's not really going for recycling because it's not making economic sense in a smaller town or village to aggregate and send it for transport. But then that's what youth have realized, that there is a gap, there is a missing link there. And it's a policy gap as well. And that's where they are thinking of coming together to see that can the collection happen over a larger area, and that can be then aggregated and then sent to recycling. But that requires that they do the studies, they try to quantify, or they work with their governments, the panchayats and the town councils, and work with the district collector to actually put a system in place. And that's why that I feel that it's important that in our studies that we understand not only the phenomenon, but try and locate reasons behind it, understand which part of the system we need to work on. There is personal action, which is an action maybe you take at home, but there is a larger policy engagement action as well. And I think raising your voice is an equally important action. Coming together, discussing, deliberating an issue, trying to understand the parts of the whole, that is an equally important action. But trying to start with a personal action is at the root of it, because then that leads you to greater and greater thinking. And so that's why I wanted to just share a simple diagram here. This diagram is, it's got, this staircase, maybe not that visible now, and there are little children on it, right? And we call this the 10 steps process to systems thinking. It's a small resource that we have. And I have this manual also, Lakshmi, that I'd like to see if it's useful, Anshul, especially if maybe take a look at it. Is it something that we can apply with especially older grade students to describe an issue, explore interconnections, see how the system description that we come up with and the problem statements that we come up with, how do they measure up against the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a fairly decent framework of sustainability. And then the system design that we develop and the SDGs that guide us with sustainability, does that give us some clues of what the actions could be? How do we proceed? And once we think of maybe this is a solution, can we try and run through with the systems again to see that what might be the impacts, what can we project into the future? Can we look into the future with our systems design and see whether the action we take will actually solve a problem or create a new problem? So this sort of skill of critical thinking, systems thinking, which I think conferences like this, the Youth Summit, spur you into looking at the problem in a much more multidisciplinary way, coming up with the interconnections. So I think that the systems thinking helps us to identify problem issues and try and reduce our footprint. But even more important, you know what the footprint is, right? It is the ecological impact. We have the carbon footprint, which measures how much carbon our actions lead to emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions. But even more important than the footprint, perhaps it's very important to understand the footprint concept, but even more important is the idea of the handprint. And the handprint is something that I want to introduce to you. It depicts the positive actions to improve the environment and people's well-being. Now, the idea of the handprint actually came from a similar sort of not necessarily a conference, but a children's activity that CE was doing almost now 15 years ago in Hyderabad, in Andhra. And Shrija was this little girl, I think about 10 years old or so. And when discussing the idea of our impacts and all these negative things, she says that why are we not talking about positive action? And I want to talk about what I can do. And she placed her handprint, as sort of the antidote to the footprint. And I think that was such a powerful moment for all of us to realize that, yes, we have to look at handprints. Again, same policy actions and personal actions, engagement actions, the whole range of positive things that we can do to address the situation. Now, since you've all been discussing a lot about waste, it seems, from the collages and installations, I want to also just introduce the Tide Turners campaign. Now, the Tide Turners campaign is really turning the tide on marine plastic. And I'm sure in your discussions you've already answered these questions. What is our connection to the ocean? Which is the nearest river to us? It's the Ram Nadi, right? It's right next to you. And the Ram Nadi joins the Mula, which joins the Mula Mutha, becomes the Mula Mutha, joins the Bhima, and reaches the Bay of Bengal. And along with the water, of course, we are putting in a lot of plastics and microplastics as they degrade and they become tiny microscopic bits. And WWF estimates, I'm sure that you've already come across these facts, that by 2050, within a business as usual scenario, this big marine plastic patch in the Pacific Ocean is only going to get bigger, and that by 2050 there may be more plastic than fish in the ocean. We already have microplastics in mother's milk, in many of the foods we eat. And there's a real need to change the scenario. And so this Tide Turners campaign is something that we've been organizing over the last 2-3 years along with the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. And it would be really great with all your wonderful work that you also join the Tide Turners campaign. Already 75,000 youth have joined in. They have their personal action stories, things that you do, but also things that you do with others. So you start, you have a sort of a level 1, level 2, level 3 challenge, and these stories are then featured to inspire others. And I'm sure Orchid School, with all the thought that you have been putting in, would really excel at showing inspirational work that you can do with your own practices, but also in engaging others. One more opportunity to have your say, which may be, 18-year-olds, and I think maybe the 12th standard, and even as you leave school and go on to college, is something called the Local Conference of Youth. Sorry, it's, yeah. Now, what is the Local Conference of Youth? You know that later this year, the Conference of Parties is going to happen in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Egypt, right? And that's the Conference of Parties with the governments. But there is also a major constituency. The UN system recognizes that youth have a say in the climate proceedings. And the Conference of Youth is something that takes place 3 days in advance of the Conference of Parties. And young people can then put in their submission for the consideration of the Conference of Parties. And the Local Conference of Youth is something that happens in different regions to take forward the ideas, the suggestions, the hopes from young people into the COI, which then goes into the Conference of Parties. And in September, just next month, we will have both an online process, and maybe you can register for it, the 18-year-olds, and maybe you could anyway have, maybe something coming out of today's youth summit, which you would like to take to the LCOI. Maybe the 18-year-olds can participate and take the voice of Orchid students into the LCOI and then on to the Conference of Youth in Egypt. I just want to show you one more picture. Yeah, so this is the process. Yango is the UN group. I'm not sure this is working. So that's the LCOIs happen in different regions in Southeast Asia, America, Africa, etc. And they all coalesce into the Conference of Youth in advance of the COP. So what is this? It's a mango shape. Yeah? It's a mango shape made up of little mangoes. And what are these little mangoes? They, some years ago, my colleagues were working in schools in the Western Ghats. And they were engaged in looking at what are the local varieties of mangoes in our village or around our village. And about 60 schools participated, and they came up with about 130 or 40 different varieties of mango. Mostly when we have mango season, we buy Alfonso, we know Pairi, maybe we know 5 or 6 different Banganapalli, 5 or 6 different varieties of mangoes. But these students found that there's a rich treasure trove of mango varieties in the Western Ghats. And it's a huge resource which is good for adaptation. You know, as climate uncertainty brings with us different regimes. Sometimes the rains are too early, sometimes the summer is very hot, sometimes it's not that hot. I hope there's a summer that's not that hot. But we find that different mango varieties will respond differently to these environmental stimuli or situations. And there may be some mango varieties that will do better even when conditions are adverse for, say, the Alfonso. And so it becomes like a bank deposit for us, something to fall back on. This is genetic resource that farmers can use, horticulturists can use to save a crop. You know, if they had some trees which are of different varieties, knowing that climate change is happening, this is something that they can bank upon and try and make a diverse plantation. And a similar effort inspired by this has been happening in Pune. You may have heard of it, which is with the bear trees. You know, this Aund area, Aund Baner Balewadi area was famous for its bear trees. And our colleague Praveen, who was part of this mango exercise at CEE, after the project finished, he has started looking at the bear trees, Praveen Tete, and they call him the Bora man. But he's been looking at, what are local varieties of this humble fruit called the bear, and trying to create a sort of genetic resource, nurseries and plantations. And so similarly, I mean, one of your topics is responsible consumption. And so as city dwellers, maybe we don't have such a lot of opportunity to do genetic varietal conservation in the city. But can we then try and look for products? Can we make a connection with such producers who are looking at diversifying their crop base or the fruit horticulture base? And there are organic stores, maybe have a real conversation with them to say that we are here, happy to support something that farmers can start to make the change with. And so again, this poster I'd like to leave with Orchid School, just as a potential, something to draw upon or something to trigger that what are the other things that we can do with genetic diversity. So yeah, looking forward to all your suggestions for how we increase our handprint and decrease our footprint. Thank you.